Guess what? The rest of the world, they're waking up. They have a very different view of this conflict. That was especially in the air at the G20 summit, which just happened in New Delhi, where it stunningly, if you don't pay attention to the news, they put this up there on the screen. The language that previously had dropped a condemnation of Russian aggression against Ukraine was actually did not appear in the joint communique that was released by the entire G20. They say, quote, G20 leaders have failed to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine in their joint statement after both China and Russia, of course, rejected language that blamed Moscow for the conflict. But it really wasn't just them. The New Delhi actually summit declaration only referred to, quote, the war in Ukraine after a formulation of supporters in Kyiv and then also people who'd have a very different view of the conflict could not come to some sort of consensus about how things were going to refer to the conflict. The previous G20 actually did refer to, quote, aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, where Western diplomats and also Chinese officials did not put into the same place the blocks to stop that language from appearing, which shows you clearly things have changed in the geopolitical situation where they have enough juice, not just China and Russia, but places like India, Brazil, and others that have a very different view of said conflict. They even have the external minister of affairs of India. He said, quote, it is a fact today. It is a very polarizing issue. There are multiple views of this. There are a spectrum of views. So I think in all fairness, it was only right to record what was the reality in the meeting rooms. The big takeaway, mine from the G20 summit, Krystal, was just how far the U.S. and Europe are moving away from the consensus of the rest of the world. Because you had big landmark meetings between Modi and MBS. You had meetings with the Chinese and the Russian officials. Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, actually met with Prime Minister Modi on the sidelines, and it was pumped up by the Indian government because they rely on them, of course, for a portion of their oil supply. But also, President Lula of Brazil appeared prominently in a photo, not only with Prime Minister Modi and with President Biden, but came out directly afterwards and he said, hey, I'm hosting the G20 next year, and Putin, if you want to come, we're not going to arrest you as a part of the international, whatever, criminal court tribunal. I mean, these are not things that you do whenever you're afraid of the West, afraid of Europe, or in terms of their view on Russia and Ukraine. It's what you do when you have a completely different view. You're looking out for your own interests, and you think that the war in Ukraine, while you think it's important, you think it's unjust, you know, what's happening there, you're like, okay, it's not the primacy of how I'm going to base my entire foreign policy. So Washington's decision to make everything about Ukraine, every single thing that we do, you know, alienating so many of our allies. The G20, to me, is a much better view of how this is going as opposed to the G7, because the G20 is the actual emerging economies all across Asia. And it's also no surprise that President Biden right now is in Hanoi in Vietnam because he needs to shore up what's going on with our Asian alliance. And Vietnam is our number 10 trading partner. Like, reality is beginning to hit us in terms of our obsession with this conflict.
It's accelerated the realization of a multipolar world that, you know, we were already heading towards, but this has helped to consolidate that new reality. And you can see it when a country like Brazil is like, no, we're not going to go along at all with what you think, with what you say. We're not going to be ugly or mean about it, but we have a different view of this, and we feel very comfortable asserting it and looking out for our own interests in this conflict. Same thing with India. You know, it's interesting, the news coverage of the G20, because, and this is sort of understandable given that the language last time around was a little bit stronger and, you know, they weren't able to condemn Russian aggression, which, you know, I think that they should be able to do. But there was a lot of shock that that was the case. And if anything, I'm actually surprised they were able to issue any sort of joint communique because of the size of the divisions at this point. And, you know, it was a big win for Modi, who's facing re-election, to be able to get any sort of joint statement out. From the U.S.'s side, you had Jake Sullivan, U.S. National Security Advisor, calling it a set of consequential paragraphs. They're talking about, listen, you had to compromise some if you were going to get anything done, some of their priorities in terms of getting grain exports restarted in the Black Sea. That was discussed, and, you know, commitment to that was realized within this communique, which is, I think, really important, not just for Ukrainians, but for people around the world in terms of food prices. There was another piece here that, you know, there was an effort to highlight climate change and to call for a reduction in fossil fuels, but there was also no deadline there. So it's just sort of like meaningless words on that one. Saudi Arabia, obviously not going to go along with that one either. So while some of the things that were not in the communique really underscore the deep divisions at this point within the G20 and between the US and Europe and the rest of the world in general, like I said, I'm actually surprised they were able to put anything out jointly at this point.
Another important point from the G20, Prime Minister Modi making a big show of inviting the African Union directly as a member of the G20. That's, again, acceleration. The African Union, very, very different view of the conflict in Ukraine than anything else going on in the West. They have much deeper ties with China. I just want to emphasize what you said. We're seeing a huge bifurcation with the rest of the world and us. Now, that doesn't mean the rest of the world agrees with each other. India and China have all sorts of rivalry. Actually, there was a lot of questions about Xi Jinping and China ahead of this because of a map that the Chinese government put out, which shows a border dispute. But overall, I want to, just to underscore what you said, which is I actually thought there was criminal undercoverage of what was going on in the G20, just because what was going on there and with the BRICS, that is clearly going to define a huge portion of geopolitical, not only tension, but division and evolution in the next century, as opposed to the amount of slobbering coverage that Western-based ones like G7 and others get. Our future is in Asia. I mean, like I said, anyone who can read an actual table can see where our major trading partners are, where 50% of the world's GDP is, and to see the divisions also between the Japanese and the South Koreans coming together at their recent Camp David summit, as opposed to how much attention the administration pays to Ukraine. You think it's the most important thing going on in the world. I thought it was a very interesting, thing that this even happened, and to see that again going to Brazil and Vladimir Putin will be showing up most likely and facing some of his biggest critics on the world stage in a year from now. What a crazy development. I mean, think about that. President Biden will be running for re-election a year from now, I guess, if he's around, and he's going to see Putin face to face, which that's what led to that famous moment. I think it was at the G8, or maybe it would have been at the G20 when Obama and Putin had the sideline conversation.
Oh, yeah.
So you never know how these things are going to go. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, indeed.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.